Hey, welcome to the Follow Podcast. What is this, week 11, 17, 24?
Or 6, I don't know.
Where we ask the question, what do you do when Jesus does something out of character and you have to readjust your view of Jesus?
Yep.
Hey, welcome back to the Follow Podcast. I'm here with Pastor Glenn, as always, and we are looking at this week's readings from our Follow discipleship reading as we've been going through the Gospels over 90 days. Every week we sort of come back and we go, man, we're drinking through the fire hydrant. There's so many stories that, I don't know about you, but they're super familiar to me, and so I read through them, but yet I see new things pop out that I think, I have this very firm picture of who Jesus is in my mind.
Right.
And occasionally he says something or does something that I say, wait a second, Jesus.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever have that feeling while you're reading along, but it's like, I know I need to adjust my expectations rather than him.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And some of that's from our culture. Some of it's just from our own perception. But yes, that's been one of my favorite things about the reading is just, and that's really why we're doing this as a church, is to let Jesus be Jesus, get past our preconceptions and our perceptions. So.
And those conceptions come from, not only from the Bible, obviously, whatever experience we've had, but we've had religious experiences that are shaped by the church we grew up in or didn't grow up in, and the various ways that we've been taught the Bible. And sometimes those frameworks are things that we latch onto even more than the actual Jesus we see in the Bible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole discussion there, but everything, the songs that we sing, that, you sing those songs and you repeat them and all of a sudden they're like gospel.
Yeah.
And they're often really good, but yes, that's good.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that jumped out at you this week in terms of just the way that Jesus was represented or the interactions he had?
Yep. I actually jotted down a couple things I was thinking about. I guess neither of these are surprises to me, but boy, they just stood out as so strong. And the first one is just the kind of person that Jesus accepts, welcomes, applauds, and those that he rejects. And so I just jotted down, the people he accepts, in some of the readings, I'm sure I missed some, but are the widow that keeps bothering him, the tax collector, the children that are brought, not just the leper, but the Samaritan leper, the humble, the last-minute worker who was standing around until 5 p.m. and then started working. Those that are rejected are the rich, the Pharisees who have it all together, the young ruler, the self-righteous, the ungrateful, and it just stands out to you of how much Jesus is on the lookout for humility and how much self-righteousness apparently really repels Christ.
Absolutely.
And,
these are the people we wouldn't hire and the people we would hire, and they fall into categories that are completely different than what Jesus is looking for working with. Absolutely. As you think about those people groups and really us as just as people in our society, the people that we associate with, the people that we don't associate with, the people that we reach out to and don't reach out to, how does that affect the way you look at the world around you?
Well, I think we're not Jesus, but I think we want to be on the lookout for humility. Someone who's approachable, teachable, humble, you can do anything with that person. But when there is that kind of self-righteousness, it's not that we don't love them, we don't reach out, but it really is much more difficult. And I say that, you're kind of asked it in terms of how we look at the world, but probably just one of the biggest applications I wrote this week was be humble. Don't be a Pharisee. Don't think you got it all figured out. Be humble. So
I have a tangible example of this. Is during the Upward season, every weekend I get a list of coaches I have to end up calling because of something that's happened. There's been a conflict. There's been an argument. There's been somebody who came unglued at a referee or something else like that. And whenever I call that coach, I immediately say, hey, I heard you had a rough weekend. Tell me what happened. And I want to let them talk and download their information. And I can tell you exactly how that conversation is going to go based on the way that they
100%.
say, well, I maybe got out of control too. The moment I hear that line of humility, that line of accepting their own responsibility, I know I can work with that guy. But the guy that says, or the gal that says, well, you should have seen what they did and how they did it, whatever, I go, okay, I see where we're at right now. And it makes it so much harder to deal with that person. You see, that's Jesus' work.
That's
a
great example.
Yeah.
I see I missed a call from you too.
A little bit later.
Steve, this is off the subject. We're pretty off the Gospels already, but what an important trait to teach our kids, right? To not just that defensiveness, to be able to back off that, to be able to enter into humility, to not always be right.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
It's what a valuable thing to teach our kids. And we teach it, they learn it from us, of course, but.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and obviously, one of the things that I found very difficult this week, or as we talked about it, is it came up over and over again, the wealthy people,
Yeah,
the rich man. And,
right.
and trying to filter that through our North American, we are the wealthiest country in the
Right.
wealthiest time in history, and we are wealthy. There's
Right.
no two ways to look about that, and yet you see so clearly the teachings on wealth. How do you process that teaching on wealth from the seat that we sit in? You and I have both been overseas. We've seen missions in various
Yeah.
countries. I'm excited to go to Guatemala in just a couple of weeks because for me, it resets my clock about what's important and what isn't important when I go to a place that's a little less wealthy. How do you filter that stuff for us?
Yeah, that's a good question. I hadn't thought of how I would answer this, but I think because obviously a person can pursue wealth and Christ.
Yeah.
And Christ even equipped some people for that. But I think it's such an issue of priority. It's such an issue of lordship, and even kind of that self-righteousness sort of thing. Like if I'm consumed with my money, there may be people 10 times more wealthy than I'll ever be that handle it with a sense of humility and generosity and sacrificial nature, and that's great. But it is, there's no two ways around. It is easier for a camel to go through the eyes of a needle than for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
Because we just get twisted around. It's a great check for me. I mean, you and I, we've had this conversation, I'm not saying we're getting older, but you and I have had the conversation of you're at the age where you start thinking about retirement sort of stuff, which is like, kind of a...
Do I have my money stacked high enough?
Do I
yet?
have it stacked high enough yet?
Yeah.
Which is just not a gospel thing.
Right.
And yet, we're to be good stewards. So all that to say, I'm wrestling with that, Steve.
Yeah, well, this week started with that shrewd manager who...
Yes, that's what I was just going to bring that guy up.
And the line that he uses at the end is, but Abraham said to him, and this is in the midst of this weird interaction with a guy in the burning place and all of that. But he says, so remember that during your lifetime you had everything you wanted and Lazarus had nothing. But it talks about this idea of like, you had the purpose of this wealth is that you would use it to influence others, to be a
Yes.
blessing to others.
Yeah.
And so instead of apologizing as Americans for the wealth that we have, I think instead we need to see it as this great responsibility to use that wealth in such a way that it makes an impact on others.
Yeah. Hey, by the way, and I think we sell ourselves short if we put a cap on that.
Oh, totally.
Here's my 10%. Some of us need to be given more than that.
Absolutely.
Anyways, hey, another thing too that's interesting to me, I think one of the more convoluted things Jesus says was in this week's reading, and it's about it's the parable where the guy says he uses his money to basically to influence his friends. And
Yes,
Jesus says,
yeah.
you're wise if you spend money
Yeah.
to buy friendship.
That's what he says.
And we're like, oh, that's the worst.
Yeah.
But I think it just shows you the difference of maybe it's relationships compared to money, just the value of them. I don't know. What do you do with that passage? It's such a strange one.
Well, that's sort of what I was talking about. And sometimes Jesus says, or we see things in the Gospels that I'm like, well, that doesn't line up with my little happy picture of Jesus.
That's always been one of them for me.
Yeah, right. So he says this thing, and it's like, well, you're a genius. Why in the world didn't I think of cheating myself?
Right.
Yeah, but honestly, it lays out that idea that material wealth is really just a tool in our hand to be a blessing to others. And like you said, I mean, there are some vastly wealthy people throughout the Bible, right?
Yeah.
We see them. Women that really funded Jesus's campaign of 3 years in a lot of
Yes,
ways.
yeah.
And so, when we see those people, we don't look down on them. We think, wow, how could I make enough money that I could unleash, generosity and blessing to others? So,
And I think that fits with Jesus' teaching
Oh,
for sure.
totally.
I do think, this is a check on me, both as a pastor, teacher, as well as just in my personal life, to not water this stuff down, though.
Yeah.
I think it's okay to say, it's hard to be wealthy and a Christian.
It is.
And, I mean, why would we not say what Jesus has said? So.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Okay, the other one that messed with me really big time is the interaction with Lazarus. Does that story mess with you?
I just love it.
It's some of the interactions of the things that he says, Yeah. Well, rather than going right away, he
Right.
waits. And then when he gets there, he enters into the emotion of that whole story, right? I mean, the Jesus wept verse is
Beautiful.
that one where you're thinking to yourself, you knew this was happening. You delayed coming anyway. You get there, and then you're really moved by what's happening
Right.
around you, that you weep with these people, which I love the compassion of Jesus of that, even though he knows what he's going to do. Heck, he said ahead of time, don't worry about it.
Yeah,
I
right.
got this. Like, he's gonna come back from the dead.
Doesn't it say like Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus, so he waited?
So
a
he
little
waited,
longer.
like 3 more days, and I'll go see him later. But then, and I don't know if you caught this, but this is one of those things. It says, when Jesus saw her weeping, this is Mary. First he interacts with Martha, but then he goes to Mary. And Mary says, if only you had been there, just like Martha
Right.
said. When Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled.
Right. Who's he angry at?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it looks like the crowd. It almost is like it's interlaced with this interaction with Mary, whom he loves, it seems like. We are told
Yeah.
very clearly. But then Jesus weeps. And so I just guess there's this wondering for me, because I don't see Jesus as an angry dude.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
we don't have a whole lot of good Jesus one-liners.
Right.
We don't get a whole lot of comedy out of Jesus, you
Right.
know, but I think Jesus was probably a funny dude.
Yes.
But when I think about Jesus angry, I think, oh yeah, what is it that makes Jesus angry in a moment like that? Because even a few verses later it says, then Jesus wept. The people who were standing nearby said, see how much he loved them. And so I really see that like emotion, that compassion, that like connection that
Yeah.
Jesus has with this family in specific.
Yeah.
But then it says, in verse 38, it says, but some said this man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? And then in verse 38, it says, Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb. And I think to myself, and granted, we've seen this, where he talks about the crowd who's expecting a miracle, who just wants a show, who has
Right.
and Jesus instead is
missing
entering-
the point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're missing the point, and Jesus entering into their suffering.
Yeah.
I don't know how that story affects you, but it's one of the kind of challenges my characteristics of Jesus.
Yeah. Well, I think especially as he starts to move towards the cross, there's going to be times he's frustrated that the crowd is missing it, that the people are missing it. You know, I wish I don't know this off the top of my head, but I'm wondering if that word, you know, the splagizomai, compassion word,
Yeah.
is sometimes translated as anger because it's it's like a
Deep.
stirred up,
Yeah, right,
stirred up.
yeah,
So
right.
it could be a mixture of those things. But yeah, no, clearly it bothered him.
Yeah.
And you know, again, maybe it should bother us when we miss the point or when people miss the point.
Yeah, because you would think Jesus would just smile and go, "Watch this," but he enters into their deep suffering and into their situation, which sort of gives me hope and compassion too.
Yeah, boy, but you definitely see the emotion of Jesus there.
Oh
that's,
man,
yeah,
big
that's really
time,
good.
big time. The man with leprosy, obviously. There's some hard teaching. What are the things that were sort of hard or difficult for you along the way this week?
Well, obviously the stuff on wealth is challenging. There's all that teaching that's not difficult to understand, but difficult to apply in our culture on divorce
Oh,
and
big time.
remarriage. You know, we kind of read that and
Yep. Put an
Don't-
asterisk next to
next
some of
to
it.
say, yeah. And this is not, well, I think what stirs up in me is, well, you know, making people feel guilty or,
Yeah.
you know,
Pe-
and I, you know, I don't, it's hard to even talk about 'cause you're like, oh, I don't want to make people feel bad or guilty, but
Yeah.
Jesus is pretty clear on divorce and remarriage.
Yeah, super clear. In fact, I've had conversations with my kids as we talk about relationships and others that are failing in certain ways around us in our family and other places. And they've said, well, Dad, you just don't understand. You've got like the miracle situation. You and Mom love each other. And my response is, yeah. We've had some seasons where we were, you know, had to work through some stuff. And it isn't always like this. But in some ways, you've got to continue to work for this, and you can't just, you know, sort of give yourself the asterisk way out. And so, you know, I hear people say, we never use the word divorce, we never, whatever else it is. And I don't want to be unsympathetic to people who have gone through it. Like, I understand I don't understand your pain. I don't want to
Right.
pretend I do.
Yeah.
But in the same way, I understand what kind of pain can be involved in that. I've heard enough stories, I'm sure you have
Right.
too,
Yeah,
where you're like, oh,
absolutely.
that sounds terrible.
Yeah. Yeah, probably one of the more difficult conversations that I regularly have, you do too, is the blended family struggle.
Yeah.
You know, and there's some ways, even these are godly Christian people, you know, and we know tons of people that have remarried and been happily remarried for 20 years,
Yep.
but still not only carry some of that
Oh, totally.
baggage and struggle, but
I absolutely had a buddy who went through a difficult divorce and spent a long time alone. And when he was getting ready to get married, he went through a very theological process trying to figure out was it okay for him to get remarried. And I walked alongside of him for that. But he used to say over and over again, Steve, this is why God says don't get divorced. And he'd have reason after reason after reason after reason.
Yeah.
And he's, happily remarried at this point, but it's just one of those seasons. And I have to say it to people all the time. I say, listen, you're never going to hear me say, get divorced. I'm
right.
just not going to say it because I just don't see it in the text.
people really want their pastor to tell them it's okay.
Yeah, really, yeah. But there's so much very real pain involved in that and very real hurt and heartache that goes along with it. And we want to enter into that pain. But I also would say Jesus is big enough to heal that pain. Jesus is big enough to reconcile that pain.
Right, and where you are is where you are, and you go forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the things, not that Jesus needs us to defend him in any way, but even, all of this hard teaching is born out of compassion.
It is.
Just like you say, man, I teach my kids this because I want the best for them. Same with even the money stuff. Jesus is like, I know what you were made for. You weren't made to be satisfied by money or a bank account.
Right.
So live this way.
Or even by a spouse. Let's
even
be
by a
honest.
spouse, yeah.
In some ways, the reason that divorce is such a hot topic is because people are so much looking for this relationship to fulfill everything. And I say to people, sometimes I do the things I do with my wife, whom I love deeply, but I do it because I know that's what God wants me to do. And I know that's the kind of person Jesus wants me to be. It's a blessing to her all the time because if I'm the guy that Jesus wants me to be, I'm a blessing to her.
Yep.
But honestly, my first loyalty is to him. And then hopefully it leaks out on her all the time.
It does.
Well, she's not here to answer that, but.
Hi, Nicole.
Yeah. One other thing that I sort of noticed, and it sort of ties or converts over to your sermon is, there's a line that keeps repeating in the Gospels. It says, where Jesus will say, your faith has healed you.
Yeah.
Your faith has healed you. And in a day and age, and even in a society where healing is not, readily, out there outside of
Yeah, it does
movies
happen,
yeah, absolutely. Well, we see it happen, absolutely. But the role of faith in healing, how do you process that? Especially given this man
I see,
who was at the pool of Bethesda. He's showing up every day, somehow getting there, right?
Right.
For 38 years.
Yeah.
The whole time you were preaching on Sunday, I was thinking to myself, 38 years ago was 1986. I was a junior in high school. Like, I'm trying to imagine every day getting up and going to the pool, every day getting up and going to the pool and being disappointed day after day after day after day.
Right. Well, one of the big things that has stood out to me in this whole 90-day reading is just how much Jesus, I can't think of a better word, but rewards even those seeds of faith.
Totally.
When there is faith, he responds. And so absolutely, not just healing, but the work of Christ in our life is going to come, not because of our faith, but, comes back to that when we're humble, God can work with us. It's Jesus making that call to you and saying, hey, I need to talk to you.
Yeah.
And is your first response, well, da-da-da-da, or is it, oh, Jesus, I'd love to grow in this. And then, boom, I can help you with that. So I would say the place of faith and healing or faith and growth is absolutely essential.
Right.
So
we live in this weird tension, or at least I do, of, grace and faith alone and all these things that we believe, honestly. But we also see this tension between faith and works. And we see this tension between, taking this step of faith and then watching God reward that faith, And so I'm always trying to get my head around that with all kinds of healing. Good Lord, man, the number of people that have had cancer this year is unbelievable. And every time you hear it, you're like, are you kidding me right now? And some people find some remission, and some people find healing for a little while, and then some people succumb, and we do funerals, and we weep with those who weep, and we rejoice with those who rejoice, and we don't know how long it's lasting. And all of it is held in this tension of what brings healing and what doesn't bring healing and why. And I don't know how you make sense of that. Sometimes I'm like, God gets to be God, but I do still want to respond in faith towards those people who need healing, even physical healing.
yeah. Yeah, we trust God can do those things. So,
Yeah.
hey, I'm sorry to this just kind of changing the subject a little bit, but in the passage from Sunday that we
Yeah.
preached on, where Jesus heals the man by the pool, and that amazing physical healing,
Right.
I admit, partly just for time and kind of the way the sermon was organized, I kind of stopped short on the story. You need to go back and read the rest of John 5, because there's this whole kerfuffle over he was healed on
The
the
Sabbath,
Sabbath,
yeah.
and the Pharisees are upset about it, and the man's kind of not sure what to do, but then he goes to the temple, and it says that Jesus finds him at the temple, and these are the words Jesus says to him. He says, afterwards, Jesus found him at the temple and told him, now you are well, so stop sinning, or something even worse may happen to you.
That is a weird verse.
Right,
Yeah.
right. What could be worse than 38 years
Yeah.
sitting by the pool?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what could be worse is eternity apart from
Absolutely.
Christ. So to me, this doesn't answer your question, but it shows you kind of the values of Jesus, which are the physical healing, yes, and the physical compassion, but oh my goodness, what about your soul as well?
Yeah.
And so I don't know about even holding those in tension, like you say, but just the value of both of those
Well,
things.
I think it highlights the point that physical healing, whatever kind of physical healing, is temporary.
Yeah.
It's just
Woohoo,
temporary.
Lazarus is raised from the
Absolutely.
dead.
Lazarus is going to die again. And
Right.
the guy who can't walk eventually is going to be 85, and he's like, I can't really walk anymore.
Yeah,
and,
that's right.
and, you know, so this healing thing that we deal with these bodies, I don't need to tell you, many people know I threw my back out about 5 weeks ago, and I've been actively praying for healing for my back, and so a bunch of people have, honestly. And it's motivated, at least for me, because I'm like, God, I got stuff to do. And really, it's motivated by ministry. I want to finish upward. I got a trip to Guatemala. We got Easter coming, all these things that I want to be mobile for. But if God chooses to let pain radiate down my leg, and I still do all those things, and I do it in his power rather than in my power,
Right.
or even
Don't do all those things.
or I don't do all those things, like my wife would argue is God's will for my life. But just slow down a little bit. All of those things can still be within God's power, within God's compassion, within God's kind of love for me, if that makes sense.
Hey, and that really jumped out in this week's reading for me. One of the things that I jotted down was after he raises Lazarus from the dead, then people are starting to get like, okay, we're going to have to do something here.
Yeah.
And there's Caiaphas,
Pharisees,
the high priest, who's like the bad guy.
Yeah, totally.
He's the bad guy.
Yeah.
But Caiaphas says, he's the one who says, well, they're like, well, we should kill him, but then the people are going to be upset. And Caiaphas says, better is one man to die than a whole nation to be destroyed.
Yeah.
And it's almost people, scholars have seen that as a prophecy of where Jesus is going. And it's the worst case scenario. Oh, Jesus, they're going to kill you.
Yeah.
But there's also this like God's sovereignty in that. And it's like this turning point in the story, because from this point on, they look for a way to arrest him and kill him.
Yeah.
And it's both terrible and the pathway to freedom.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, which is just amazing. And for me, it just gave me a real sense of being able to rest in God's sovereignty. Right now, my daughter-in-law is in the hospital getting ready to have a baby, which is a wonderful thing. This baby's coming probably about 6 weeks early, which is, it's dicey under any conditions. We believe she's getting great care and all those things. But as I read that, it gave me a willingness to just be able to sit in the peace of God's control.
Yeah.
Now, again, that was can feel a little like an easy one, because I knew she had great doctors lined up and getting all these tests. But there is a sense of, oh my goodness, this isn't what we wanted, what we hoped for, but God's in control.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so
it's actually funny, that verse that you referred to, verse 51, it says, he did not say this on his own. As a high priest at that time, he was led to prophesy that Jesus would die for the entire nation, is the translation that I use.
That's a great scripture.
Yeah, and so you're like, wow, okay.
Yeah.
Like, that seems like such a hard teaching, and so, like you said, kind of opposing, but it's not. It's a part of what was getting ready to come down.
Yeah, because really Caiaphas is not saying something great. He's saying, we're going to kill him.
Yeah.
And the Lord led him to say that because this is how it's going to work out.
It was going to happen that way. Yeah, so. Any final words for our church, or as we head into another week of learning from Jesus, and we're going to rip into another miracle this weekend in the book of John, another sign. Yeah.
I guess the thing that I just jotted down was just to encourage people to keep pressing into to be like our rabbi. I've written down what are the application points for me, and they're like, be like Jesus, do these things, which is obvious. But the one that I was thinking about is, hey, let's just be known for loving the broken and loving the hurting. Jesus goes to the pool where the sick people were, finds the sickest person, and zeroes in on that
By
one.
the sheep gate, if
By
I
the
remember
sheep
right.
gate, yeah. Which you're kind of like, oh, gross. The pool is by the sheep gate?
Yeah, right,
That's
yeah.
disgusting.
And that's where you can find Jesus.
I know, and that's where you can find Jesus. So I guess if I just had kind of a blanket encouragement to anyone who's listening and to the church family is, let's just love broken people.
Yep.
Let's embrace it.
If you're looking for Jesus, head to the sheep gate
Yes.
at the pool of Bethesda.
Yes.
Anyway, all right. Well, thanks very much. Hey, we're so glad you joined us today for our podcast. We will see you next week as we continue. We're almost 60 days into this, so we're
Woohoo.
almost 2/3 of the way through these Gospels, and I'm excited to see how it winds up and gets us right to Easter. So God bless you today.